excited to be here. I'm Yusuf Al-Balushi, faculty in Peace Studies, and we're really excited to have Dr. Jared Ball here with us tonight. I'm going to turn the mic over to one of our Peace Studies students, Christina Kim, to introduce Dr. Ball.
Hi everyone, it's really nice to see some friendly faces here on this seemingly spring day. I have the honor of introducing Dr. Ball. Dr. Jared Ball is the father of two brilliant and adorable daughters, Maisie and Marley, and the fortunate husband of Melis Bay Ball. After that, he is an associate professor of communication studies at Morgan State University, where his research interests include the interaction between colonialism, mass media theory, and history, as well as the development of alternative underground journalism and cultural expression as mechanisms of social movements and political organization. He is the author of I Mix What I Like, a MiXtape Manifesto, and co-author of A Lie of Reinvention, correcting Manning Marable's Malcolm X. He hosts and produces radio with WPFW 89.3 FM in Washington, D.C., WEAA 88.9 FM, and also hosts segments with the Real News Network. And he could be found online at imixwhatilike.org. I was just this morning. I was just watching one of the episodes of the show you host, and it's crazy that you're here. There's a lot of insight that his show and his guests bring, and that he brings to our campus from years and years of work in the Baltimore community. Help me in welcoming Dr. Jared Ball.
Thank you, Christina. And we are especially excited to welcome Dr. Jared Ball here to Goucher College as a part of our Peace Studies speaker series to Black Lives Matter, Local Reflections on Civil Rights and Beyond. Our first two events were fantastic. We had a great turnout and a wonderful conversation, and we're looking forward to the same tonight. Part of the idea for this series was to provide a local perspective, in a sense, people right here in our backyard, on some of the issues that we've been exploring as a campus throughout this semester. And we also have been hoping that our speakers and their own experience and their ideas about the world provide kind of feedback and fruitful platform for exchange with some of the work that our students are doing on campus. So tonight, the format will be an exchange. I'll be asking Dr. Ball a series of questions in an attempt to get at a broad overview of his work. And as you already have a sense, there's quite a lot of it, right? It's quite multifaceted. And then we'll open up halfway through for what promises to be a very rich Q&A with all of you. Before we jump in, I also want to thank him again because he's not feeling very well. So if you come up to him afterwards to shake his hand, don't be offended when he refuses your hand, because he doesn't want to get you sick either. So despite not feeling too well, he still showed up today.
And I owe one of your colleagues an apology because I accidentally shook her hand just out of... Yeah, sorry about that. It's not that deep, but just in case. Anyway.
All right. So we're going to jump in with the question of colonialism, which seems to be an incredibly important concept for your work. You make an argument for the continued importance of colonialism in our present context, both to understand world politics as a whole, but also to understand the internal racialized dynamics within the United States itself. Can you please define the term colonialism for us and tell us how you understand it in its multifaceted sense within the U.S. historically and also in our colonial present.
So first of all, I appreciate the invitation to Goucher and to this conversation in particular. I appreciate all of you for being here. I appreciate the energy and the vibe that exists in these spaces. And it's an honor, so I just wanted to start with that. Colonialism for me, I'll borrow from Fanon, who I think made it the most plain. He said, colonialism is about the total and complete conquering of a land and people, period, as he put it. The reason I've tried to borrow or extend or borrow or continue a legacy or tradition of applying colonialism to the conditions of African people or African descended people or black people or African Americans or Africans in America or new Africans is that I think it more appropriately leads to understanding of the relationship that continues to exist between not only black people in the United States as a state, but between all the groups contained therein. It's not a perfect analogy, and people have been debating and arguing this for centuries. But it goes back for me to what Martin Delany once tried to argue in the 1850s, that black people, as is the case with all nations, there are nations within nations, and black people constitute a nation within a nation. And if that nation is colonized, as I argue and would continue to argue, then the principles of colonialism need to be extended to that analysis. So in other words, we can't understand the relationship black people or other groups have to the state with these constant refrains to the myths of democracy and progress and pluralism and meritocracy, et cetera, and so forth. But and then to work back from those myths to say, well, the various problems that continue to confront these communities as a result of something being wrong with them or the imperfections of American capitalism and democracy. No, these are the intended, predicted, necessary conclusions in terms of the conditions that we see black people existing in, and I think colonialism is the best way to understand it. So I've just been trying to extend a long-used approach that has been suppressed over the last probably 20 or 30 years, particularly in academia, as people try to get careers and maintain, bourgeois statuses in society and get tenure and all the other things that trap us into these, very ultimately safe and uncontroversial careers. But as we even see on your wall out here with the brief history of civil rights concluding with Black Lives Matter and Trayvon Martin pictures, I mean, we obviously, and then if you just look at the material conditions and the numbers that keep coming out, I was looking at a report the other day that was arguing that the gap between black and white income and wealth is larger now than it was in 1967. So is this because there's an accidental glitch in American capitalism or democracy, or is there a better way that I think we could, is there a better way to interpret that relationship and that history and then the current conditions? And I think colonialism is the best way to do it. Plus, it allowed me academically to attach the work I was doing to all my favorite thinkers, many of whom come from outside the United States and who were engaged in what, for me, were the highest levels of either intellectual or actual material struggle. And since we're using his book this semester, the one flaw that I found in Prashad's book, The Darker Nations, is that he does not include Black America in this group of people struggling in an anti-colonial way. And when you're reading about Bang Dung and Arusha conferences and gatherings, and you don't hear about Malcolm X or Paul Robeson or other people's attempts to connect our struggle here to that, that's the one mistake. So analytically, I think that's a mistake that people continue to make when looking at black people here, as if black people weren't created as a black population here, just as other colonial settings were creating Nigeria and Tanzania and Mexico. Puerto Rico, all these places are imperially created projects, as is this nation called Black America. So why shouldn't those principles apply there?
I'm glad you you mentioned civil rights as part of that, because I'd like to take us there, being that we are exploring precisely that theme on campus all semester. And I wanted to draw a little bit from one of your books, Mix What I Like, where you make the following statement. We react to proclamations that change and progress have occurred with little real thought. We even allow these claims to stand in defiance against the conditions we see or experience. The claims are ideological. Acceptable boundaries of thought, expression, and certainly action are protected to assure that no unsanctioned change actually takes place. So I would suspect, and correct me if I'm wrong, that you might apply something of a similar analysis to the ideological role that the civil rights movement plays in a dominant common sense understanding, at least. Maybe not in the actual historical movement. But with this in mind, I'm wondering if you can respond to these two questions. First, give us just an understanding of your understanding of the civil rights movement, its successes and failures. And then please tell us what lessons the civil rights movement has to offer us today in 2015, perhaps with regards to its overall achievements, its failures, its evolution and trajectory, and maybe even its foreclosed possibilities.
Wow. I mean, essentially, and then please make sure I answer the question if I don't. I mean, essentially, you know, well, sort of like what I was just saying. I mean, if we look at the conditions that continue to face the people, just starting with black people, if we just start looking with a focus of black America, or African America, or New Africa, or Africans in America, or whatever. If the argument, so the argument has been, since for my generation in particular, coming up in the mid-70s, civil rights occurred, Dr. King pretty much solved everything, your generation has it better than everybody else, it's now up to you. That's basically, by the time we get to the generations represented in this room, I mean, the propaganda is so almost complete that, particularly now with a black president, that to the extent that, I mean, I'm thoroughly impressed to the extent that people have rebelled at the levels just of Black Lives Matter, given the wave of propaganda that keeps saying, look, I know these police brutality incidents keep happening, and as my colleagues in the Malcolm X grassroots movement showed, really even more than every 28 hours, a black man or woman is killed by a police or someone representing a police endeavor in this country. If we see all that, and then if the propaganda is telling us that all of this is happening, all the poverty, all the inequality, all the discrepancies, all the mass incarceration is happening despite civil rights having completed a successful, progressive change in this country. When even those who were struggling at that time were very clear, Dr. King being prominent among them, in saying that everything we've done so far is insufficient. I mean, Dr. King used the language of saying that if we stop now, it would be like rushing the ball to the 50-yard line and calling it a touchdown. He, much to the surprise, I think, of many, given the wave of propaganda, was one of the most ardent critics of the white, liberal, and black bourgeoisie communities who were benefiting the most from the civil rights struggle without contributing to it. All the while, the conditions of the greater community were getting worse. This is while he's still alive, before he's assassinated. So by today, if we get to the point where you can identify that the material conditions of black communities are worse now than they were then, the propaganda works against those communities by saying, well, it's because of you. I mean, I had an argument with the chair of the political science department at Morgan State University a couple years ago because he publicly, proudly, unapologetically was telling black students at Morgan State that their unequal conditions are the result of a black American, particularly black American cultural flaw that prevents African Americans from accepting or benefiting from all of the wonderful opportunity that has been bestowed upon us. This is the kind of propaganda that I think has been attached to the civil rights movement. in part to take credit as a nation for, I mean, America, it's like for those of us who struggle with our beliefs in the divine, or those of us who are just, straight out atheists. I mean, we sometimes look critically at those who believe, and we say, God gets a great deal, because everything that goes right is to him. Everything that goes wrong is our fault. And that's kind of like how it's been working with the civil rights movement. Like, the country gets all the benefit of saying, yeah, I know we did the slavery thing. I know, I mean, my bad, but then they'll even say, we did you a favor. We got you out of Africa. And look how jacked up Africa is, as if they're not responsible for that too. But then they'll want to also take the credit for being the kind of nation that can not only enslave someone, but then give them the pathway to the presidency. So they get it at both ends. It's like, well, wait a minute, we can't condemn you because now we have to praise you. It's like that Chris Rock joke saying that the relationship between black people in the United States is that between, is like having an uncle that molested you but paid your way through college. I mean, it's this really like, we're going to give you nothing, and then, or we'll take everything from you, give you just a little bit, and we want the credit for that. And the propaganda around the civil rights movement is all about that, saying, yes, we created the conditions that made a civil rights movement necessary, but then look at how wonderful a nation we are that would allow you to have one, and will now put up statues and monuments praising your efforts at having a civil rights movement, even as we deny you everything that movement was designed to produce in its first place. Now, we'll of course truncate the history, so we won't talk about how people became, as I said with Dr. King and others, critical of the civil rights movement, how the Black Power movement emerges, or how the Black liberation struggle emerges even beyond that. So we might even let you hear about the Black Panther Party a little bit, maybe a little more than a little bit, but we're not going to talk about the Republic of New Africa. We're not going to talk about the Revolutionary Action Movement. We're not going to talk about the guerrilla warfare that Malcolm X wanted to engage in. We're not going to talk about any of that. We're not going to talk about the Black Liberation Army, many of whose members are still locked up today as political prisoners. We're not going to talk about any of that because that upsets the mythology that we gave you the civil rights movement and now everything is good. I struggle with this word failure. I did want to say a quick something about that. I don't like to say that the civil rights movement failed, in that even when you engage in a struggle and lose, it's not, how do I want to phrase it? Failure, it puts too much of a negative spin on what happened. Here is a relatively powerless community or communities rising up in a righteous struggle against the most powerful state in the history of humanity that is repressed at levels that many cannot understand, given the power not only of the state to do it, but to erase it in the minds, in our memory, or re-image it through propaganda that makes the repression either go away or entirely or look even righteous or necessary. I mean, they make, Clint Eastwood tried to make J. Edgar Hoover a hero in film. I mean, I just flew back into an airport named after Ronald Reagan. I mean, this is... So I don't, failures, what has not occurred is the regrouping of the movement, a reorganization of the movement, understandably given what has happened to that movement and what has happened in the years since that movement was most aggressively assaulted. So I don't want to use the word failure, but it is incomplete. I mean, the movement has not completed itself, as those who were in it at the time were saying it was not doing. So if there's anything that I think we need to learn from the incompleteness or the incompletion of that struggle, is that it is incomplete, and that a lot of what those people tried to do was right and needs to be emulated and updated. And maybe we'll come back to this with the Black Lives Matter piece, but there's been this interesting, that I've witnessed, struggle between those engaged today and those who have been previously engaged, trying to offer some positive critique of what they see happening, and what I would call a defensiveness from those engaged, and a lack of organization from those of us who should have been preparing this generation for this moment, is leading to a lot of, I think, confused and even unnecessarily hostile exchanges, but is more about the incompleteness of it, or the unfinished, of the unfinished nature of the battle, as opposed to just a failure. I don't want to. I just struggle with that word. As you see, I'm struggling with it in front of all of you right now. But that's. I did want to just say a word or two about that. So in terms of what the lessons it has to offer, I mean, did people here see Selma?
Yeah.
So first, it's important to immediately recognize that Stokely Carmichael was erased from the film, that Diane Nash had one line in the film, that James Foreman was recreated into a composite character to deny, and was described in the film as sort of a young, angry militant when he was King's age and had already been to fight in a war in Korea, and yet is somehow depicted in the film as an immature, just immature and angry young person. But if so I bring that up to say that we could learn from the reality more than the media or the filmic depiction of the history, and understand that there was a lot of study, a lot of training that went into it. There was a lot of preparation. There was a lot of struggle over ideas and getting on the same page ideologically, and before people got into as people, I should say, got into the movement and got into struggle, that I think we could learn from today. And then finally, I would just say that we should learn from those who are still incarcerated, the political prisoners, because they represented the most, to me at least, literally the vanguard and the most advanced radical nature of the struggle, and that's why they're still paying the price to this day. And I think we should open ourselves up to some of what they have to say. We should engage them. We should look to learn from them. And then do a better job of organizing ourselves into actual movements and organizations, as opposed to what some are summarizing as moments. Once we've gone past the initial protest and the initial anger, how do we get in rooms, stay in those rooms, study, build, strategize, offline, off the record, and come up with some solutions that I don't think we can come up with publicly. That's one thing I think we can learn from the civil rights movement.
Well, you already brought up Malcolm X in that commentary and his influence upon guerrilla warfare in one sense as a strategy. I want to talk about Malcolm X and ask you to reflect on Malcolm X, in particular Manning Marable's book on Malcolm X. When Manning Marable was working on this book, which he was working on for quite a while, there was a lot of kind of hype around it. Right? He presented it as something that was going to expand upon the autobiography as a narrative. He would drop little hints about it potentially revealing the fact that Alex Haley might have had a relationship with the FBI, that potentially Malcolm's work towards the end of his life had been erased from the autobiography, with the idea being that, of course, that Manning Marable's new text would shed some light on these issues. So a lot of us were very excited by it.
He was also going to have those missing chapters.
Yeah.
From the autobiography.
So you, after the book came out, were part of a collection of scholars thinking critically about the book and about it as a contribution to Malcolm X's life. And you published an edited book called A Lie of Reinvention, Correcting Manning Marable's Malcolm X. In this book, you introduce the collection as one of editorially defending and extending the legacy of Malcolm X and the ideas with which Malcolm most seriously grappled. So, with that in mind, I want to ask you to...
I'm sorry, it just sounds so arrogant coming out of you. I know I said that. I don't know. I'm sorry, go ahead.
So,
it's like, I'm going to defend Malcolm.
Nonetheless,
Yeah.
I'd like to ask you exactly about that project, right? So one, what was Malcolm X's relationship to the civil rights movement, since we've just been talking about that? Two, what were some of the central problems to your mind with Manning Marable's rewriting of Malcolm's life? And then third, I want to ask you about how you see the legacy of Malcolm's work, both living on into our present and being extended, as you argued, right, in that introduction, by current thinkers and movements.
Well, I mean, you know, Malcolm X, there's a lot to say. You know, Malcolm X was I mean, his relationship with the civil rights movement changed, it evolved, it radicalized, as I would prefer to describe it. And what I think that he represented then is something that I think is sorely needed today, to the extent that it doesn't exist, you know, which is that there's this hard, unforgiving critique, an unapologetic refusal to accept any concession as progress, of someone who worked to maintain an appropriate political standard for what it is we should be doing. In other words, you know, one of the problems that I have with the way the civil rights movement is brought back up in today's conversations is it's often connected to Barack Obama being the culmination of the goals of that movement, and that was never the point. And Malcolm was a clear representative of how that was never the point, as he constantly reminded people that if the collective is not benefiting, then what the hell good is an individual benefiting? And he extended it farther and farther. I mean, you know, in terms of if you know, beyond just one black person benefiting while the rest of the black community is suffering, it became, well, what good is it if one black community improves if the rest do not improve? What, you know, to the same questions that Nkrumah was asking of independent nations in Africa. What good is Ghana's independence if everybody else is colonialized? This is what Malcolm, so that's why he came up with that line that I'm about to butcher again of you know, if a man plunges a knife 9 inches in your back and pulls it out 6, he's not to be thanked, and that's not certainly solving the problem. It's barely even addressing the wound itself, but never mind is it repairing anything. I mean, and that was the kind of thing, so as he got to the end of his life, and despite this attempt to mischaracterize him as softening and becoming an integrationist, he was becoming, his standard, he was saying, okay, so white folks, if you want to work with us, then your standard for involvement should be John Brown. In other words, are you willing to pick up guns and kill other white people so that we can be free? And if that's not your standard, this is in the last month of his life. So when people try to say, oh, he said that earlier, that was before Mecca. No, this is in the last few weeks of his life. He was saying, and his point was, I think, we can't accept a standard that's going to say, well, you'll put a few black people in the university or a few black people in TV, or we'll even give you a president. That's not. So that's what I think his relationship was. And he was willing, up until the end of his life, he was working with the Revolutionary Action Movement to talk about guerrilla warfare in the United States. He was willing to talk with Dr. King about electoral politics and strategies in the South. He was willing to link up with every militant leader in the African and broader diasporas. I mean, I always bring up, when you read Congressman John Lewis's book, you should read his memoir. I mean, he gets all this media coverage now. First of all, you should ask, what are the conditions of black people in his congressional district? Okay, I'll stop there. But if you read his memoir, he says in 1964, when he was part of SNCC and traveling around Africa, he happened to end up everywhere Malcolm X had ended up. And everywhere he ended up, every leader told him, if you're anywhere to the right of Malcolm X, we don't even want to talk to you. Now imagine what that is saying, that internationally, the standard for black American participation in international politics was Malcolm X. That's the kind of threat that he represented. This was not someone who was going to say, oh, sure, you want to militarize all of Africa's militaries and have AFRICOM dominate Africa's military? Sure, go ahead and do that. Oh, China, you want to come in and take control over, you know, Sudanese resources? Oh, come on in because, you know, at least you're not white, or some kind of nonsense like that. I mean, this was not the standard. He was, in other words, he had situated himself as the most left, progressive, militant leader in the United States, but as that standard bearer for the world. Yeah. So what Marable's book, and we don't really don't have time to get into it, but has anybody read Marable's book on Malcolm X? Just one person? Okay. So, our argument was, just a long story short, was that Marable represented what is a major problem in academia, in that is this attempt to ideologically situate people like Malcolm X in such a way to make people today think that if you read or study Malcolm X, that you could still be accepting of what the world has for you right now. In other words, if you read the epilogue of Marable's book, and you see the way he tries to situate Barack Obama as the culmination, or if you read Peniel Joseph's work in Black Power, who's one of Manning Marable's proteges, another person that I'm in as much as I can be, sort of I don't know, an intellectual death struggle with, like one of us has to leave, we both can't leave. But what I'm arguing that they're doing is that they're saying, look, we want to write about Stokely Carmichael and Black Power, we want to write about Malcolm X in this history, because we know that this is too important to get rid of, we can't erase it, but we want to write about it in such a way that when you all read it, you will not see any contradiction between what they're saying and what's happening now with the current political leadership of the day, whether it's Obama, whether it's Sharpton or Jesse or whoever else is or Van Jones, whoever's popping up right now. When you look at them, you would never look at them critically, because these books are telling you that what Malcolm and Stokely were arguing for was Peniel Joseph keeps saying, a radical transformation of American democracy. And that we more or less got that with the election of Barack Obama. Well, what are the material conditions of the people who are supposed to be benefiting from these elections? I'll just start there, you can see the fallacy in these claims, never mind the contradictions in the argument. So add to that really poor scholarship. I mean, for someone who had hundreds of thousands of dollars, 20 years, Ivy League support, research staff, there's no reason to have so many glaring errors, misquotations, truncated quotes that distort the message. There's just so many flaws in that book, in Manning Marable's book on Malcolm X, that many of us, I mean, there's another collection of essays critiquing the book from Third World Press. And my argument ultimately, personally, was that the ideological lens used to interpret Malcolm X was one that was hostile to those ideas, and therefore tried to rewrite them in a way that would soften them and make them more palatable for an affluent white audience, which is what you need if you want it to be a New York Times bestseller, which is what the goal of that book was. And then if you just, there's so much more. I mean, we can maybe come back to that, but but mostly, when you, as one of our colleagues pointed out, when you read, for all that may have been wrong with Malcolm's autobiography, have you all read that book? If some of you said no, you must. Whatever flaws there were in that book, Kamau Franklin makes the point that when you read that book, it makes you want to become a radical or a revolutionary. When you read Manning Marable's book, you kind of like, okay, he was a nice fellow, and you move on to the next, And that's sort of what the point, I think, of these books are, these recastings of the history, even I think the failings in films like Selma. The goal is to not make you angry to the point where you would become as radical as the people depicted, but angry to the point where you might, maybe, vote for a Democrat. And then that'd be about the extent of your radical behavior. And that's what I think is the flaw. So that's what I'm saying. You can't not have Stokely Carmichael in the movie about Selma unless you want to get rid of all the radical analyses that would eventually be attached to him, including popularizing the phrase Black Power, his radical approaches to socialism, Pan-Africanism, armed struggle, etc. That's the only reason you pull that stuff out, so that your generation, many of the young people represented in this room, will not pick that up. You're angry enough, righteously as it is, just with Black Lives Matter. What happens if you actually study Malcolm and Fanon and Assata and so on and so on? Then the level of the struggle might just increase beyond what is acceptable, and that's the point. Yeah, I'll stop there.
Well, you've spoken a little bit about film, Hollywood, Selma, and I want to ask you about another central area of your expertise, which is the media, right, as a professor of communication studies, but specifically the dominant media. And in your book, I Mix What I Like, you state popular mass media that targets Black America, among others, fragments the population via specific multi-genre productions, channeling and monopolized ownership that consistently present the most limited range of Blackness and provide little to none of what can be considered news or change-encouraging information or cultural expression. So can you just briefly for us elaborate on this claim by providing some specific, ideally contemporary examples of what you're talking about with regards to the absence of a diversity of Blackness in the press, and also with regards to the absence of genuine news?
So there's nothing novel in that claim, that statement that you read of mine. People have been making that argument for a long time. It just happens to still be right, which is a problem. So recently, and I hope this addresses your question, but recently on our radio program I started using, to introduce our show, the first voice you hear usually at this point is Marshawn Lynch, saying, "What up, Africans? Shout out to my real Africans." Because I suspect that statement, more than anything else that he did, is why he didn't get the ball at the end of that game. Actually, I do believe that on some level, but really what I'm saying is what I think caused a lot of the problem and the backlash that he got for making those comments and his behavior was that he was constantly reminding the sports media, the press that was following him, that not all Black people are quickly ready to fall in line with your exact preferred mode of Blackness whenever you put a mic in front of them. So, yes, there was a problem with him not wanting to give long, verbose responses. Yes, there was a problem with him wearing his beast mode hats and shirts during the interviews. But the real problem, I think, is when he referred to Black people as Africans, which has a long, deep history in this country. There's a major problem with white society in this country. I think he triggered a white unconsciousness and reminded folks, like, oh my God, I thought we had completely eradicated this nonsense. But him coming out of Oakland, which is important to this, he's coming out of a community that has a particularly advanced, radical analysis and approach. So this was not, I think, at all an accident or even something that would be impossible to imagine happening. But I think that that was sort of my point. When I saw that last play in the Super Bowl, that was the first thing I thought of. They were like, okay, my God, if we give him the ball and he wins the MVP and wins the game, we got many more hours of commercial time dedicated to this guy. He's got to do I'm going to Disneyland. He's got to get the MVP. He's got to do all this stuff, and he's going to be on there talking about Black people are Africans and calling African that's what I thought was like the. And people really should look at the history of that label being applied to Black people in this country has been a tremendous, tremendous battleground. To the point where even, I believe Leslie Alexander, Michelle Alexander's sister, and I think I'm still the only one to interview them both at the same time. And then there was a problem that occurred after that with a critique of Michelle's book. But Leslie she wrote a book. Leslie Alexander is another brilliant scholar, and she wrote a book where she talks about how even if I remember this correctly, even the American Colonization Society that wanted to put Black people back in Africa rather than let them be free here and negatively inspire the not to be free, that they basically said, if you don't take African out of all these names, African Methodist Episcopal Church, the Free African Society, the Free African Women's Society, I think in Philadelphia or somewhere in Pennsylvania, if you don't start taking these names out, then we really will send you back. Like, you can't be here and be African. You can be there and be something, but you can't be here and be African, because then that starts attaching you to all kinds of pieces that we don't want you to reconnect with, that we've been trying to disconnect you from for so long. And here comes Marshawn Lynch in 2015, just completely messing up the whole. They're like, damn, we've been working on this for hundreds of years, and this dude is still. But anyway, so that essentially is it. But when I think, when you look at Well, I'll go back to something else. It came up again in do you all watch Empire and Power? Do you all watch these shows? Okay, I don't watch them at all, but I saw an argument on Facebook that included an article that talked about those two shows and Scandal. You watch that too? And it reminded me of an argument that Ishmael Reed and many others have been making for a long time, that what many black people are confused into believing is that the product on television or film, because it contains black faces, is targeting black audiences. And it's not. Only 1/8 of Scandal's audience is black. For all the conversation about Shonda Rhimes and all this stuff and this, that, and the third. And my point in that is that these shows contain blackness, but as Ishmael Reed pointed out when talking about the film Precious and Lionsgate Films and Tyler Perry, who I think now have divorced, thankfully. Lionsgate Films was looking to fill what they call the niche market of black films that white audiences want to go see. And they said white audiences don't want to see The Great Debaters. They don't want to see The Miracle at St. Anne, which I think is one of Spike Lee's best films. I think it's a great movie. They don't want to see that blackness. They want the black pathology, because it's that reaffirms their own, going back to why I appreciate the colonial analysis. This is what Memmi and Fanon and Césaire and so many others were saying, or as James Baldwin put it, and I keep quoting, like, when a white man calls me nigger, I don't get mad. I ask him why you need me to be one. Because if I'm not the nigger you think I am, you're not the white man you think you are, and then everything falls apart. And these images, media images, are not about, they are as much rather about self-defense. You know, Walter Lippmann, the famous journalist, he has a section in his book on public opinion about media representation as a self-defense mechanism. And he even uses specifically the example of negative black imagery, not to just denigrate black people, but to make white people feel better about themselves. Fanon talks about national public, well, I mean, I use his analysis to talk about NPR, but Fanon talks about Radio Algiers as being necessary for the white settler, not as a propaganda tool against the Arabs. It was a tool to remind the French settler that you are supposed to be where you are. And that's how I argue NPR does in this country. NPR is here to make wealthy white people feel that their settler colonial dominance is necessary, is righteous, it's justifiable. So that's why, so when it's targeted, when this purpose is focused on apparent blackness in film or television, it's not for black people unless it's a sort of an ancillary purpose. That is, you know, the real purpose is to give white people something that will make themselves feel safe about containing black people as a colonized population right next door. Ancillarily, if that's even a word, as an ancillary benefit, it teaches black people this is how we want you to behave if you are to be successfully functional in this society. So what do you get? All the black pathology you want. And as one of my colleagues keeps asking, where is the black love? Did you all see the film Dear White People? Mm-hmm. As one, I think it was an NPR reviewer, he answered the movies, the white reviewer answered the movie saying, yes, I know this film is directed to me and here's my response. Yet many black people were saying, this movie is for me. And I'm saying, no, this white reviewer got it better than you did. This was a film for white audiences, which is why the only hero in the film is the white man boyfriend. He's the perfect character, other than her unseen father. Black revolution is described again as immature and a passing fad. I had a whole list of problems with that film. For me personally, the discussion, even more personally for me, the discussion of biraciality and interracial relationships is depicted as really childish. Again, this whole thing of, well, first of all, that only those of us who are so-called mixed are confused, that no one else is confused. Everybody else is perfectly clear. Only the mixed people are, and only those, and the involvement in black radical politics is only so that there can be an immature transgression into realizing it's all an immature response to something, and then she can literally walk off the film with her white man in her hand, like that's the. But my point in all that is that, as my colleague said, there's no room for black love. There's no black love in the film. There are no black people falling in love in any meaningful way. That is just not. Or as Bell Hooks said years ago about Crooklyn. Anybody see Crooklyn? Spike Lee's Crooklyn? This is another one of his best movies that people don't. Bell Hooks said, and she was right, white critics got mad at the film because they said there was no plot. And Bell Hooks was right, he said, no, it's not that there wasn't a plot, it's just not a plot you're interested in. It's about a black family struggling, the mother dies of cancer. Now, if she had been selling crack and dropped her babies out of a window, now, okay, here comes the white audience. Now the white audience is like, okay, we got that. We can hang with that. Why? Because we don't define ourselves by who we are as much as we do as much by who we are not, and we need to define against. So white society needs to say we can't. White people can't just say we're wonderful. They have to demonstrate the lack of wonder in blackness, brownness, etc., and so on and so forth. I don't know. Did I even approach an answer to the question?
You did.
Okay, good.
I want to make sure we get to, if that's dominant media, I want to make sure we get to insurgent media.
Well, real quick, that was one of the problems that I had. I Mix What I Like, the book I Mix What I Like, I will proudly say as an idea is brilliant. It's really like the best idea I ever came up with, best project I was ever involved in. It's a wonderful, wonderful idea. The execution of the book is imperfect. I'm heavily self-critical on that. But one of the things that I got in a lot of trouble for in that book, more or less, is that I was critical of the white left media. And I think this is important because it's very easy, particularly for those of us on the center left or wild left, to critique the mainstream. It's so easy to critique Fox, CNN, the Washington Post, and the New York Times. I mean, that's so easy, and it's done often and well. The problem that I had is that the so-called alternative press doesn't often do enough to be an alternative, particularly when it comes to race. So, one of the points that I was trying to make is that at one point, do you all watch Democracy Now? Anybody not know what I'm talking about when I say Democracy Now? Okay, good. Well, Democracy Now, democracynow.org, it's a daily television and radio program for the left, produced by Amy Goodman out of New York on Pacifica. And it's very important. It's extremely important. But my problem was a couple of years ago, there was a study that came out that said Meet the Press is the flagship NBC News show. Had, I think, 77% of its shows did not have a black guest. So then I just said, well, okay, if Meet the Press is the flagship for the mainstream, Democracy Now! Is certainly the flagship for the left. And when I did the study on that, it showed that 88% of her shows did not have black guests. So there was actually less black representation on the alternative than the mainstream. Now, the guests she had were better. I mean, the shows were better, more important, but in terms of this particular issue, it was worse. And I think that was one of the things that I got a lot of pushback from the intended audience of this book, which was that we need to be critical of, and going back even to my point about Malcolm X, our standards are too low. It's too easy. Of course Fox is going to do what Fox does, and how hard is it to be critical of Bill O'Reilly? I mean, come on. I mean, really. It's much more, I think, important and of value to be critical of those who you're supposed to be working with and engaged and struggle with. So it wasn't like a critique to say, damn you, it was to say, we need you. By the way, this is an issue that people have routinely. I mean, this was, many of the main leaders that we all point to had the same critique of the white left in particular as they advanced in their work. That whether it was King, whether it was Malcolm, whether it was Asada, whether it was Claudia Jones, they all had this similar, Hubert Henry Harrison. We get with these white radicals, and then at a certain point, there's this block. And we can't get past this issue of white supremacy, even among the left. And I thought that it was important to make that point in today's, and again, but it did not go over well.
Well, that's the title of the book, right?
I Mix What I Like.
Steve Biko.
Riffing off of Steve Biko.
Yeah, that's right. It was very critical in South Africa of white South Africans who were also
A
involved
perfect example,
in
exactly.
anti-apartheid.
Exactly.
Feeling like they still wanted to direct the movement.
That's right. Or as King said, he thought that they had more in common with he said that they had more in common with our oppressors than they do with us.
So give us a sense, though, because I want to ask about
Okay.
the mixtape specifically.
Okay.
And in the book, you say, you're trying to think about alternative media. You say, if given time and appropriate attention, something as simple as a mixtape can perhaps unexpectedly reveal the nature of today's mass media and their relationships to and function in support of colonialism at home and imperialism abroad. So, a couple questions about that.
Okay.
First, for all of us, can you just explain what exactly is a mixtape? Secondly, what are its historical and geographical conditions of emergence, right? When does a mixtape emerge? And what's the role of the low-tech mixtape, as you put it today, in an era dominated by the internet and social media?
Yeah, I don't know. That last one, I really don't know. So the mixtape, obviously the cassette, the technology of the cassette had come out of Europe many years before this, but in the late 60s, early 70s, the ideas of putting songs in your own order on a cassette pre-exists this history. But in terms of hip-hop, the mixtape emerges in the late 60s, early 70s as DJs would record their parties onto cassettes and distribute them through barbershops, beauty salons, cabs, mostly in New York City and around the East Coast. They would be custom-made tapes sometimes for people in the neighborhood so that they could drive around and hear their name called out by a DJ on a tape. My generation coming in, in the early to mid 80s, started to see the shift and the boom of the mixtape, as Angela Ards puts it, as the mixtape became hip hop's first national mass medium. There was no rap radio, there was no rap video, there was black radio in particular would not play hip hop at all. It was a very bougie, we don't want to be dragged back to our Negro past type of response. So there was nowhere to go. So the mixtape became this conduit where hip hop would even be carried down to me and Howard County down the road here. Then even the people, my generation superstars like Kid Capri and Ron G really made it an even more popular phenomenon. And then of course the commercial world got involved, and by the late 90s DJ Clue is pretty much a commercial sponsored DJ product who waits outside of Sony for some unpre-released, track that he can put on a CD, moving it from cassette to CD, but also getting rid of the brilliance of the DJ, the mixing, the blending, the breaking of original records, or the blending in of old records and creating something brand new. All of that was replaced with DJ Clue just kind of lining them up on CD and putting his voice over, Clue, 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 Clue. Illuminati, and that would be it. And then the commercial industry could use the mixtape as a way to sort of drum up street credibility and promotion in advance of an actual release. And that's how a lot of major acts got broken, from 50 Cent to I don't know, whoever's hot right now. Now the mixtape is mostly digital. It's on places like Dat Piff and other places where it's almost exclusively used by artists wanting to get an album out or to get their music out without an actual album or a studio or a contract with a label. And then there's this offshoot that's interestingly and I think important for some study or more discussion, dominated by mostly white and Asians, this turntablism where the more traditional brilliance, deep brilliance of the DJ is more commemorated than I think in other spaces. That is the manipulating of the turntables beyond just simple blends and scratches into, I don't know, creating a whole bunch of wild and different things. What its relationship is now, I mean, initially when I wrote the book, the argument was we use the mixtape to promote in our community in DC, our political organization. It had become the journalistic outreach mechanism of our organization. We put radical music with radical interviews and stories, or locally based stories where we're trying to make people in the community, the experts speaking on their issues, all trying to blend that into a mix, and then we would distribute that for free on a CD. At this point, I really don't know, as everything moves to digital, to online, where things like SoundCloud can block your upload for copyright infringement, or things like MixCloud won't let you download or rewind. The digital space is becoming very co-optive. It's becoming it's changing the nature of the mixtape and communication in general, and I think taking us away from some important offline, underground, in-person kind of exchange into something that's so easily monitored, so easily dominated, and yeah. By the way, that's part of the critique I have in the book about where we are with the internet, and I think in that instance I'm correct still, that if we look at what the internet is and is not doing, it is clearly not well, obviously, on the one hand, it's very simple. The rise of the internet is also, comes along the rise of the, greatest inequality we've seen in history. What they say, Oxfam said by next year, 1% of the world will have 99% of the wealth. So the idea that the internet is democratizing and leveling the playing field and, is on that level, I think, easily exposes a myth. And if you start to look at where money goes, where it's invested online, if you look at the arguments over net neutrality, and I hope you're all following that. This was a recent temporary victory, maybe. But what we're seeing is really a lockdown of our ability to communicate, and it's so much more easy to monitor us, to corral us into certain spaces. And then if you just look at how the internet is used, overwhelmingly it's it's email and porn. So it's not like, there's this wild radical exchange of ideas leading to, it's the largest movements, the largest rallies, the largest marches all occurred pre-internet. So again, the idea that it's going to be this panacea is, I think, something that needs to be more heavily critiqued as we continue to move into it. But what it means for the mixtape, I really don't know. In many ways, another strong critique of my book was that it was too late. It was outdated. Arguing for a radical use of the mixtape at a time where everything is moving online, and so my soft response was, yeah, but the arguments I'm bringing to bear should be applied to the internet. That is, the colonial relationships, the unequal relationships we have out here aren't just going to disappear because we plug in. So that's what I was just trying to say. So, and honestly, I don't know. But this is another thing I struggle with some of my colleagues and comrades on. Like, what are we doing with the internet? This idea that I have a blog, you have a blog, I tweet, you tweet, fake. That this isn't the kind of collective radical use of media and journalism that I think we need, and it's in many ways, I think, encouraging much more fragmentation and individualism than not. And so anyway, that was one of the questions I was trying to consider in trying to make this argument for the mixtape. And what to do with that now, I really don't know. I don't, the latest laptop my university gave me doesn't even have a CD port in it, so I don't even know, I don't know. I don't know. There is a mixtape museum. Someone I just came across a couple of years ago, mixtapemuseum.org. You should check that out. Summer Reagan McCoy, she runs that and is trying to develop an online, a warehouse for the history of the mixtape. The Neiman Group out of New York, I think, tried to steal my idea. They wrote a report saying that that mixtape journalism will be the hot new thing for 2015. I just quietly reached out and said, well, for us it's been the hot new thing for about 15 years, but, anyway, whatever, I don't know. So maybe they got something new on it that I don't know. But I don't know, I really don't know. I don't know. But I am worried.
Well, if you want to learn more about the mixtape and Dr. Ball's views on it and the media, definitely I recommend checking out his book. We've got a lot more questions, but I'm only going to ask one so that we can open it up.
Okay.
And I'm hoping that all of us will get to a lot of these points that you've been raising with regards to, especially Obama, because I think that you have a unique critique of Obama, and as you've said in other places, not everybody was on board with Barack Obama's campaign as early as 2006, 2007, 2008. So So I think that's an important piece that hopefully we can get to in the Q&A, along with Black Lives Matter, which you've also been referencing. I'm sure people will want to hear your thoughts on Black Lives Matter, and maybe on Baltimore specifically. But what I want to ask you about, as a last question, is about Afro-pessimism. And Afro-pessimism is an emerging field of thought, community of scholars, most particularly probably associated with Frank Wilderson and Jared Sexton. I know you've had Frank Wilderson on your show, and I know you've been debating their theories. And in part I want to ask you because a number of us have been studying the ideas of Afro-pessimism on campus. And our first, one of our first speakers, Davon Love, who's a member of the Leaders of the Beautiful Struggle here in Baltimore, and who has a book out on Baltimore where they talk about
The Black Book. It's a good, very good book. You should get that,
They talk about their understanding of Afro-pessimism, how it feeds into their political project. So I'm wondering if you could just give us a little bit of a sense of this emerging field of thought, the centrality of anti-blackness as opposed to racism generally for them, what they phrase as the afterlife of slavery, that is to say, when slavery was abolished, right, we're still living with the central relations that slavery established to the present, and their critique of coalition politics and the possibilities for coalition politics. But feel free to draw on whatever you would like.
Well, first of all, I mean, I'm not an expert on this at all. This is all very new and deep and difficult for me, and I've only come across it in interviewing Frank Wilderson. I just want to be careful with how you phrase, just to make sure people are clear. We weren't debating them as if they're wrong. We've been engaging with Frank and Jared Sexton and to a lesser degree Celia Hartman as a way of trying to understand what they're arguing and apply it to our work. I don't disagree with it at all. I just don't know that I fully understand it. But essentially, what Afro-pessimism is arguing is that something that Orlando Patterson said some years ago, that as a result of enslavement, black people have suffered a natal alienation. That is, that the black child born under slavery was immediately disconnected from his or her family through the ownership of the master, and was permanently dislocated from what could be considered humanity. So even through to this day, black people the world over are never in any case, and can never in any case, be seen as human beings. And this leads to the incomplete nature of all the struggles related to African people the world over. That it is particularly anti-blackness, that it's not even just white supremacy writ large, it's specifically anti-black, and that all the other groups contained therein suffer mightily, but differently from those defined as black, who can never be seen as human. So beyond that, beyond that, it's a struggle for me. And the work is deep. Frank Wilderson's even his media critique, Red, White, and Black, History of U.S. Antagonisms in Film, something like that. Brilliant book, but very, very difficult for me. And a concept that's very hard to deal with. This idea, and he himself talks about the struggle that he feels constantly with this idea that what do any of these things that we engage in mean if by the simple fact of our being defined as black, we can never be seen as human? So this is why he thinks that there are always struggles between generating allies, aligning ourselves with other communities in struggle, because they too will eventually get to the point where they look back at the fact that these black people are sub or without humanity, just not even subhuman, just without humanity. Simply put, for me, it's hard to argue or disagree with that when you look at the way the history of interracial or intercultural or the dovetailing of movements have occurred, and where they've left black people consistently the world over seems to be pretty clear that if not perfectly correct, there's something to be said for this approach. And then when you hear Frank Wilderson and Jared Sexton argue it much better than I am, it might be that much more meaningful. But in terms of this question of do Black Lives Matter, well, no, not to anyone outside of Black people. By the way, this was one of the biggest problems. Did you all see Fruitvale Station? This was actually one of my biggest problems with that film. That, as Ryan Coogler, the filmmaker, argues himself, so much of the film's goal was, as he said, to humanize Oscar Grant, that I think it softened the blow and softened the reaction to the killing of Oscar in the sense that, because to whom do you have to explain that Oscar was a human? And this goes back to my previous point. The film was all about convincing white people that Oscar Grant and Oscar Grant are human beings. Well, what if you already accept the humanity of Black people? That to me would be why the film didn't do, I think, enough to well, this, okay, so let me go back one second. So this is one of the reasons why Frank Wilderson talks about how he has a line we always quote him and say, he says, I don't hate police brutality, he says, I hate the police. And he says, but he says that, because he said, the only way for Black people to have this discussion of their conditions in this country with other communities is to do it through something like police brutality. Like, that's the soft way of having a conversation with non-Black people about the condition of Black people in this country. Because as bad as it still doesn't speak to the nature of the police themselves, or why do police exist in the first place. And specifically, what does that relationship mean in terms of policing Black people? And of course, the police were created here in the South to police Black people. And in the North, to police working people. So there's this pattern that I think fully, and I think Frank argues better than I am, doesn't get brought into today's conversations or analyses sufficiently. Well, again, this question that Orlando Patterson raised in the 1980s of natal alienation. What does it mean to be born, to suffer social death? Socially, Black people are dead. There is no humanity. But my point is, so if Black people's humanity has to be explained, if, as I think happened in Fruitvale Station, the police's presence, if you watch the film carefully, the presence of the police on the platform at the end of the film is made to be seen as justifiable because of the previous violent exchanges that Oscar had been involved in with this other gang member. Which presupposes, again, that the police have a right to be here in the first place and that they're necessary. Then it sort of softened, the film did, the history of the racism of those cops involved. And if you ever read the transcript of the trial or heard what came out of the trial, it was so much worse than that. And and then more so, it downplayed the aftermath, that is the uprising of the communities in the Bay Area and around the world even, in response, because the film had to, at the end, not make white people uncomfortable. It didn't want to make white people uncomfortable, so it left it as this was just this cop. Oscar kind of deserved it, because we've seen him be turned into a victim of flowers. So we saw him selling weed, we saw him as an unmarried father, baby daddy, we saw him get locked up, we saw him cuss out his mother, we saw him have fights with other so-called, gang-like people. So by the end of it, we saw him slack off his work, but then they inserted very important scenes that have really no relevance other than to support my point of him being nice to white people. Y'all see the film? What was the point of him being nice to the white woman that was founded by his kid? What was the point of him being nice to the white couple looking for a bathroom on New Year's Eve? And then just before he's gapped up on the train, he sees that same white woman again, and they have like a little moment, and then all of a sudden the beat starts. What the hell is all that in there for? And then read why was the film picked from the Sundance Film Festival to be, widely distributed. Harvey Weissman said he said it made him human for me. And other critics of the film said, one critic of the film, a white critic of the film said, a positive review of the film said, Coogler could have gone in that angry Black way of telling stories of police violence, but he didn't do that. He humanized Oscar. To me, this was the point. And I'm not trying to dog Coogler as a filmmaker. I'm just trying to make the point about why this film was so widely accepted, promoted, and welcomed, and what I think it's saying about this. Trying to connect it back to this Frank Wilderson point about Afro-pessimism. That we have to see him saving the dog in the street. Remember that? Like all of that, because only white audiences have to be convinced at all that black people are human. Anyway, I'm sorry. I feel like I didn't do a great job of that. But Frank Willis's work is essential. You should check that out. Don't let me discourage you from my flimsy attempt at dealing with it. But having interviewed him a number of times and read his work, I mean, it's a fascinating, scary, intellectually challenging approach and a way to think about these things that I think has more answers in it than not. Anyway, let me stop there. So.
That was great. So with that, we'd like to open it up for some of your questions. And because we're recording, we'd like you to use the mic. So we'll pass this around. We'll start here.
Hello, Albert. So I agree with you completely on your comments on Oscar Grant just because of what happened recently at UVA with the student who was beat up at the bar. Because, like when it came out, everyone was like, he's an honor student, he's on the honor board, he's an upstanding student. And to me, the first thing that came across was not why this kid got beat up, but why does all of this matter if he's getting beat up for something? Like at first it was he had a fake ID and then he was being unruly, but it came out that he didn't have a fake ID at all, and he was randomly just pushed out because of the bartender. So my thing was, why does anybody deserve to have their head bashed and need like 21 stitches for something like that? And why does all of this information have to matter to make them human? And the second thing I had was, as time progresses and we go into the future, how do you see the relationship between the African American community and police brutality going out? Do you think it's going to get, in my opinion, desensitized, which you see things like this, the young man who was just killed in the Maserati in Atlanta, and you see people, maybe caring about it for what, 3 or 4 weeks tops, and then the next thing, Rihanna's new album is out, or Kanye West did this, or Tyga and Kylie Jenner did this, and people don't care about it anymore because they had quote-unquote lives? Or do you think it should go to something, or it will go to something more radical, and that a lot of uproar, like things reflecting the LA riots are going to happen again, or it's going to get a lot worse?
Well, one, I think it's always important to remember, as Stokely Carmichael pointed out, that every rebellion in this country with black people is started as a response to police violence. And I say that to say that, no, I don't think it's going anywhere. The violence isn't going to go anywhere. The kind of response, the responses may change. What I'm hopeful for is that, and this is always the case, on the cynical side, I'm concerned that the post-Ferguson moment will become an Occupy Wall Street moment, it will become a Genesis 6 moment, it will become a Troy Davis moment, it will become a Trayvon Martin moment, and it will just be a moment that people will make some noise and then we'll just slowly go back to business as usual, which, by the way, is my colleague, my comrade, and Arlene Ison in particular, who's the lead of the report, showed that it's every 28 hours that this is happening. And it's really even more than that. If you really get into the numbers and the details, and I have an interview with her up on our website if people want to check that out and get this, it's really more like every 12 hours. I mean, it's happening all the damn time. So all I can be hopeful for, and that I encourage, is that people become organized and study more and do more quietly. I'm not saying stop the overt angry. Like, I'm an angry guy. I think anger is underrated. So I want people to be angry. I don't want to stop that at all. But after that is over, or after those moments are over, I hope that the anger is also channeled into quiet, offline, off the internet, off the record, study and organization. that people will take, particularly college students, I know you hear this and it doesn't always register, you will not have a better moment in your life to be able to study and organize. It's never going to be better than it is for you right now. And that where I think that my generation has failed, if I use the term I don't like to be applied, is that we did not sustain organization at a level that would have prepared you all for your moment. So what people don't, so that was, I think, an important point of what Carmichael had used to say, is that Michael Brown, Samir Wright, I mean, these things happen all the time. They're going to continue and have always been happening. So rather than, as we also say, the job of the conscious is to make the unconscious conscious of their unconscious behavior. So instead of just, doing what we're going to do anyway the next time somebody gets shot, start to prepare in the interim. Study cop watching methodologies. Study, one of the biggest flaws in Michelle Alexander's book, The New Jim Crow, is that A, it had already been previously defined as new slavery, so it's like she's walking it back from what it actually is. But that she skips in her analysis the 60s, 70s, and the 50s, 60s, and 70s, and the mass amounts of radical organizing in response to mass incarceration and police violence. So in her book, you don't hear about Malcolm X, you don't hear about George Jackson and the prison movement, you don't hear about all of that, which is what you need to be hearing about. Because that's the kind of analysis and level of organization I think your generation and my generation should have been preparing you for. Not so that you could just get angry and then say, well, I'll vote for Hillary in 2016. Or maybe we'll get community review of the police. I mean, yeah, but that's not an advance over where we have already been. That I play to my daughters all the time, Bob Marley and All We Have We Is Lost. That's what I think he's talking about. Everything you have now, historically, we've already had. They just took it from us and give it back to you in pieces, and you're like, yes. So no, police violence isn't going to go away. The only thing that could change is our organization, our level of organization, our level of study, our level of commitment and preparation. And again, that's what I thought was the value more than anything else of the film Selma, of showing people that it wasn't, we didn't just run out there and with our phones real quick and make some noise. There was study and preparation. Even when we used to cop watch, you have someone, you have legal representation waiting on the phone for you. You have, you map out where people are going to stand. You prepare for who's going to do what when they do what they're going to do. And it protects everybody involved. I mean, I've heard people, from around the country talking about, they go out to a rally with their children and then somebody pops off at this rally and does something wildly dangerous and radical and puts everybody there in danger. And in part, that's because there has been no pre-organization or preparation, no study. So that would be definitely something, but in terms of predicting, other than that hopeful sort of dialectical approach where there's going to be repression, there will be resistance. We just have to organize and foment that resistance so it becomes institutional change. And I honestly don't know, I don't know exactly how to do that other than the very statements I've already made about study and building organization. Like build with people, find 3 people who already agree with you. And then just read together, talk together, study together. Okay, be thorough in correcting your work, be meticulous in your work, because it will be attacked, and you might find your career going wildly to the left and not in a good way if you don't do that. That is a threatening approach. And I don't want to, talk about academia as some sort of separate institution. I mean, it is just like everything else. So be careful and do good work and protect yourself. But I would think you could look at anything. Pretty much any field or any particular approach as looking at the conditions of black people, I think will lead you to some way to conclude or work with this Afro-pessimistic analysis. If it's not police brutality or mass incarceration, you could look at, It's something as simple as there was still an argument in 2015 over black representation at the Oscars. I mean, good Lord, really? You know, and I'm from the generation where there was at least a question in hip hop where Flavor Flav and Public Enemy said, who gives a fuck about a goddamn Grammy? The next year they give the Grammy in hip hop to Will Smith. Not an accident. Okay, all right. But my point, I'm just saying that there's almost any material indicator you could use. I'm not aware of any material indicator that would show improvement or progress for black people in any real way. So you could pick anything. Wealth, income ratios. The report that came out a couple of years ago that said the median net worth of a working age black single woman is $5. Sounds like a good place to start to me. The fastest, anything, the fastest population rate going into prison are women, black women. I think you could do you watch those shows that we mentioned, Scandal? Do you watch that stuff? I think you do a great one with Scandal. Like, what is black female power to the extent that it sleeps with white men with power? Or look at did you see how they dealt with police violence in that episode a couple weeks ago? The absurdity of a black man with a shotgun pointing it at a row of police and surviving. Come on. And then look how they carefully dealt with it. It was a singular cop, wasn't institutional. They dealt with him, got him out of there, and then they kind of moved on. The state is seen as heroic. Now, I know the Attorney General himself didn't show up, but his assistant sure did. Where our Attorney General, a very black Attorney General, says, we're not prosecuting anybody. The Wall Street criminals are too big. He actually said that, right? You remember when Holder said that, right? If I prosecute these banks that are money laundering billions for drug cartels in other countries, it will destroy our economy, right? No, I'm not prosecuting anybody who kills black kids in the street. Because as your point, Michael Brown, he stole a cigarello. And as Darren Wilson said, he brushed me like an animal or an ape or something, right? Mm-hmm. By the way, if you go back and read some of the I believe if you read even Thomas Gray's story about Nat Turner, that same argument was used for him. Like, they brushed me like a crazy, So, I don't know. I mean, I could go on. I'm having a great time thinking of how many topics you could. I mean, yeah.
Hi, my name's Anthony.
Where is
Hi, my name's Anthony, and I kind of want to get at more of an academic perspective. But this is a discussion that I always have with my family, but I kind of want to hear it from an academic person. But so in a lot of cities, so I'm from North New Jersey. It's a city in 1967 there was a big race riot. So within that city and other cities in America, there's been a lot of racial tension. But nowadays, I notice within Newark, and I feel like other mostly populated by black folks, those kind of cities, I feel like there's a lot of crime. And I know specifically within Newark, speaking about Newark because that's where I'm from, there's a lot of black on black crime, things like that. And I always kind of wonder why. Talking to some of my family members, I'm from a pretty diverse family because we're all mixed up. So even some of my black family members, they're oh well, that's just how black folks are. But to me, I don't know. I was thinking maybe it's some kind of institutionalized oppression. I don't know. But yeah. So I just kind of want to hear your thoughts on that.
I mean, I used to always ask. I would ask just straight up. Do you think? I asked this chair of our political science department when we had our exchange. I mean, do you believe that black Americans are specifically different biologically or culturally than any other group on the planet? Is there, and I don't mean obviously there are biological and cultural differences and things that are specific, but this idea that only black Americans do certain things that other people don't ever do. You know, his argument was, where I come from in the Caribbean, we don't have this kind of crime. We don't have prisons and stuff like this. And I'm like, well, that has more to do with the organization of your society, of the relationship of maybe of a private prison system, of a legal system. It has so much more to do with than the actual behavior of individuals. But look, it's as Dr. King once described them. He said, yes, I'm upset when black people rob and steal and kill each other, but these are all what he called derivative crimes. The initial crimes are of capitalism and white supremacy. So that is, as another friend of mine put it, we were on a panel and somebody said, well, it's like, we act like crabs in a barrel. And he said, well, yeah, because we're crabs in a barrel. If you put crabs in a barrel, of course you're going to act like a crab in a barrel. It's not its natural habitat. It's a crab in a barrel. It's not a crab in the sea. It's a crab in a barrel. So therefore it's going to act like a crab in a barrel. So that would be my initial, that's why I always thought that question. If you believe black people are specifically worse than any other group, then there's really nothing, there's no academic or non-academic answer you could offer. The trick for me was always to get people to at least admit, because nobody wants to stand in front of you and say, yes, because of your blackness, to whatever degree it is, you are predisposed to X amount of percentage of the crime. Nobody, at least very few people are willing to do that, even when they believe it. So once you get them to say, look, I know, of course, we're all people, of course, then you can say, well, then obviously there are other conditions here, there are other issues here, whether it's over-policing. I went to Baltimore Friends for 8th and 9th grade. Nobody does more drugs selling or doing than rich white kids. Nobody. Zero. There is zero group. I went to Cornell University. I saw, again, a higher stage. You couldn't go 2 feet. They had a house on campus. Anybody been to Cornell, go to Cornell, know Cornell? They had a house on campus, they had a frat house on campus known as an open-air drug market. You could just walk through mushrooms, LSD, weed. But be black or Asian at the time walking across campus, all kinds of problems. So my point is, whether it's over-policing, whether it's the imposed conditions of poverty, congestion, and Malcolm X, Malcolm X had a great speech about that. He said, of course, we're living on, we have no privacy, we have no room to breathe, we have no money, we have no jobs, we have no good education, we have nowhere to go. Of course we're going to do things that are either actually illegal or that you could overly criminalize. If 80% of the population is getting locked up or there for nonviolent drug offenses, then what the hell are we doing? So this idea that black people are more criminalistic because of something biological is absurd. Unless you want to say that, and I'm not trying to discount or criminalize oppression, I'm trying to say that unless you want to say that even rich white people are internally oppressed. Who was the kid, wasn't not too long ago, when wasn't it in this state, the kid who got off the affluenza? Did you all hear about that? Yeah, the poor guy. So I believe it was a young white kid who drunk driving and killed somebody or something like that. And his little legal defense that got him off was he suffered from affluenza. That is being affluent. He was so affluent that he didn't know how to function properly in this world. So why isn't that white on white crime or internalized oppression then, right? That's an oppressive, affluence is an oppressive situation creating that. But we wouldn't say that about any other, that's where I would try to start. If you just start to ask that simple question, are black people specifically flawed, incurably flawed? Does any, look at the reports that talk about, that show the rates of drug use and sale, that they're easily consistent. Everybody's high. Everybody's getting high, so everybody's getting it from someone. And yet only one group seems to be hyper-policed, over-policed. And then look at the studies of even the police themselves, where they talk about our attitudes towards black people as, they don't live in the community. They talk about going to police these communities as if they're going into the jungle. They're afraid of black people. This is what the police's their own statements. So this creates a different kind of relationship. If they see the white kid breaking some sort of so-called... I remember when I was doing my research on mixtapes and I went to New York, and I'm trying to interview young kids selling mixtapes on street corners. And I'm out there one day, and a cop comes on one of those little New York City mini cars.
Copper box.
Is that what are they called?
Yeah, copper box.
A copper box?
Cop in a box.
A cop in a box. Very good. It was like, yeah, cop in a box comes riding up. The kid grabs the blankets and runs off. And I asked the cop, I said, you know, he was huffing, he chased him like half a block. And I didn't run anywhere, so I was waiting for him, and I just said, so what happens if you caught him? It's like a 13-year-old selling CDs. He was like, oh. He looked at me, he was like, how dare you even ask that question? What do you mean what happens to him? I take him downtown, he gets a jacket. Excuse me. He gets a jacket. Like he's a criminal. And I'm like, now just try to think for a moment, where, in what setting could you even imagine a white kid with CDs on a blanket getting chased by police and locked up, like I can't wait to lock him up, like Pablo Escobar just manifest in front of me, you know, like he was. But that kid, he was right though, that kid then would get a jacket. Then what happens to that kid? What happens to that kid's life chances? What was happening to that kid in the first place that made him sell CDs on a street corner? These are the kinds of questions, and George Jackson has a great line that I'm going to butcher right here, where he said something like, if once we understand that crime is a result of the conditions imposed on people, we could, something like, get rid of all the law books and do some work, do some good work, finally do some good work. And I think that's more or less where the argument needs to be. If you want people to not act like crabs in a barrel, don't put crabs in a barrel. And if you do, expect it. I hope I answered your question.
Hi. Earlier you were talking about how to make sure that the energy of the movement doesn't fade out over time like other movements have. That it's important to educate and organize ourselves, and I was wondering if you could speak more to that with some more concrete.
I mean, I wish I could, and I know how it just sounds terribly vague, but and I wouldn't even want to change it. If I said it that way, I want to correct myself, because it's not just that these things. It's kind of like what I was saying about the civil rights movement. These things don't just fade out. I think that there is something more akin to what happened in the past with the counterintelligence program. I mean, there are direct state-driven efforts to destroy these things. We've heard about even, more recent rallies and organizations being infiltrated by various police, people being monitored. So there are attempts, I think, still to put people in certain spaces to break up any potential. So the only way I know to deal with that is what I've known has worked in the past, which is people spending consistent amounts of time together, learning who each other are, studying, getting on the same page, and then finding out what they are willing to do, and making those decisions there. That's the only space I think answers can come from. I don't really know, when I was more active, what we would do a lot of different things that I describe as unsuccessful, only because we're still sitting here talking about all these same problems. But I don't mean it to say like we're wrong for trying or shouldn't try again. But I mean, in some cases, we just started very simple. I mean, we did a lot of trying to mimic the Black Panther Party. What we understood from that, Huey Newton, Bobby Seale get together. They come up with 10 points that they all can agree on, and start collectively reading the same thing, studying the same things, bringing in people. Now, there are many mistakes that they made we could learn from, et cetera, and so forth, but I think that's the way to start. Find one or two people you already agree with. Not people you need to argue and convince, not people, I don't advocate taking that as time for your energy, but to, and then just saying, let's just read one thing together, one blog, one book, one article, and then talk about it. And then say what are we willing to do, or what strategies, or what organizations exist are we willing to join, what are we willing to do? And then just keep going. I think, I saw a documentary where Questlove was talking about the Roots and his band, and one of the reasons he said that the Roots had been successful in staying together was that he said they would have every Sunday was band day or whatever. Not necessarily that they would play, but they would just get together and watch movies or have breakfast or whatever. And I think organizations should do the same thing. Here's a day, no matter what, we're going to get together. We're going to read something, we're going to talk about it. We're going to watch a movie together, we're going to eat together, we're going to drink together, we're going to do something together, and we're going to build some cohesion, we're going to build some understanding. And then in those private moments, with the phones outside the room, with the internet off, we're going to say, these are some things I think we should try to do. One thing I would definitely like to advocate, is because it's the easiest, is that we stop voting for the two major parties. We need to develop some electoral options that are outside of those two parties. And I know this is a whole other very complicated and argumentative, and very hostile debate to have. But I think that that's one very simple thing that we should start doing, is say, like, what, who would we vote for in the Green Party, the Party for Socialism and Liberation, or I don't know, some other party.